thinking differently to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, or if I was to be a bit more honest about what the title of the talk should be, but I would risk putting you all off coming, it would be a bit more like this: challenges for scenarios and modelling of 1.5 degrees. And then I'm going to talk a bit about disruptive innovation and granular technologies. So it's really a talk of 3 parts. And I really encourage you, if anything I say doesn't make any sense or you want me to clarify, please just interrupt. So it's a talk of 3 parts, but also I like to try and do talks with some props. So this is one of my props, an elephant. This is another one of my props. Now you're going to have to use your imagination here, because this should be a sugar lump, but I was unable in 5 shops and 4 cafes and your kitchens here to find a sugar lump. So just imagine that this packet of sugar is a sugar lump. I've also got some onion, some slices of onion, which I will explain. And then my final props are actually a combination of a solar cell and a battery, and also a car, a little toy car, well, a car, and a phone. And all this will hopefully become clear through the course of the talk. And if nothing else, you might remember this as the talk with the guy who should have had a sugar lump but didn't. Okie doke. So I want to start first of all talking about 1.5 degrees and scenarios and modelling. And I'll kind of whip through the basis for why I'm talking about this, recognising that many of you in the room will know this extremely well. So the Paris Agreement, signed in December 2015, formalised this target of limiting warming to 2 degrees C. So here's the actual text, and it says, blah, 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 holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. Now, sort of analytically, if you like, that presents quite a simple challenge for us. In that, we know, there's very good evidence now to suggest that temperature is linked to cumulative emissions. And so essentially, a 2 degrees C limit implies a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we're allowed to emit, a budget, if you like, we're allowed to emit over the course of the century. So if we want to stay, if we want a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, we can emit just over 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And I'm focusing here on CO2 as the main greenhouse gas. If we want a better chance, if we want a 2/3 chance of hitting the 2 degrees C target, we have our budget of about 800 gigatons of carbon. So the question then for us who are interested in, right, well, how do we stay within this target by emitting no more than that budget of CO2 emissions? And the way we do it are by using scenarios. So we need long-term and global scenarios, which essentially are stories about how the future may unfold, which then get interpreted quantitatively by modelling tools. And these modelling tools, the kind of common modelling tools that we use to do this, are big global systems tools, which represent the energy and land use systems as the main source of greenhouse emissions, and then also how they link to the economy. So this is the sort of analysis that goes on to understand how to meet these international goals. And this is a word search in which every single clue is the same. So the clue for each of these words would be, name me a global systems model used to explore 2 degrees C. And obviously the local one that you guys will be very familiar with here is TIMES, but there are many other kind of models or acronyms, if you like, which are used worldwide. And I know, again, this is very well known to many of you, but just in case some of you don't have a background or familiarity with models, here's a very simple 1-slide explanation of what they do. So they represent both the physical flow of, in this case, energy resources through the economy, from where they get extracted from nature to where we use them in our homes, in our cars, in industry, and so on. And they also represent the financial flows, including the costs of building things, the prices and costs of using energy, and so on. And the way that they are used is that they tell us, under certain conditions, what are the optimal, or in this case, the cost-optimal ways of meeting a given future demand for energy services, useful stuff that we want to do with energy. So the way they're used in this scenario mode is the storyline from this scenario. Remember, the scenario at its heart is a story about the future. So this story about the future tells us, right, what's going to be the demand for things like heating and mobility in the future. We then tell the models, what future demand for energy services is going to be. We tell the models how much things cost, what resources are available, and so forth. And then the models will tell us, in interpreting this story about the future, the models will then tell us things like, well, what technologies and resources do we need? How much is it all going to cost? And obviously what we're critically interested in is what will emissions be? And if we're particularly interested in emitting an amount of CO2 consistent with this 2 degrees C budget, then we can put climate policy in the form of a tax on carbon to essentially induce change in the economy away from high carbon and towards low carbon technologies and resources. So a very simple rendition of what the models do. So this 2 degrees C goal has been around for a while, and in 2014 the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change essentially looked at all the evidence as to what we need to do in order to reach this 2 degrees C goal. So this was a sort of synthesis, and this drew on many studies that had been going on through the 2000s and the early 2010s to try and understand this 2 degrees C goal. And we have some very robust insights. We know fairly clearly what we need to do. Now, some of it, this may seem incredibly obvious to you, but we need to rapidly decarbonize our energy system, so we need to get more renewables and low carbon supply, including nuclear, into our system, and we need to get fossil fuels, unabated fossil fuels out. Another very robust insight is that we need to electrify. So we need pervasive electrification, not just of, if you like, realms in which we already have it, like in buildings, but also in industry and in transport. We need to see major shifts in investment from high carbon assets to low carbon assets. There are big costs. If we delay action, it gets harder and harder and it gets more and more expensive. So we need to take concerted action as soon as possible. And I think for me, possibly the sort of real headline insight is that the sorts of improvements in energy efficiency that we've seen historically, both in terms of the economy as a whole and in terms of specific applications, devices and technologies, these have to sustain, this continued improvement has to be sustained through the 21st century. So robust insights for 2 degrees C. So all well and good. And then along came the Paris Agreement just over a year and a half ago, and also enshrined this even more ambitious aim of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, or aiming to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this has essentially set this enormous challenge for people like me and people like some of the people in this room who are trying to work out, well, what do we need to do in order to reach the 2 degrees C goal? We now are being asked to work out, well, what do we need to do to reach this 1.5 degrees C goal? And the government's essentially also commissioned a special report by the IPCC on this 1.5 degrees C target. So to kind of frame that in terms of the emission budgets that I was just talking about, here are the 2 degrees C emission budgets that I showed you. That's what the 1.5 degrees C emission budget looks like. So if we want a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees C of average global warming, our emissions budget from 2011 to 2100 is under 400 gigatons of CO2. Now, to put that in perspective, between 2011 and today, we've used up that amount. So these boxes are all proportional to the size of the emissions budget. When I was making this, I was realizing it's actually a bit of an optical illusion to work out how big they are all relative to one another. So that's what they look like if you superimpose them all on one another. So here we were in 2011. The red box is the emissions we've already used up, if you like. So our remaining budget to stay within 1.5 degrees is what you can see of that green box. And you may well be thinking to yourself, that's going to be a tall order to stay within that if we've gone from there to there in 5 years. So you can see the sort of magnitude of the challenge, if you like, to the scenario makers and the modelers who are trying to work out how we do this. So the Paris Agreement has created this, yes?
Can you just say, what fraction does that correspond to, the red box compared to the green?
It's just over a half. So the red box is about 200 gigatons of CO2, and the green box is just under. I should say, there's a lot of uncertainty about, there's a range, but these are sort of median estimates. Yeah. Okay, so this has then created this demand for, well, how do we reach this incredibly stringent 1.5 degrees C goal? And there have been a few studies published, and there are many more being published and coming out now. And what are the key insights which we learn from these studies about reaching 1.5 degrees? Well, my kind of fairly simplistic interpretation of what we've learned so far is really absolutely nothing. We knew pretty well what we needed to do for 2 degrees C, and for 1.5 degrees C, we just need to do more of it, and faster, and harder. So, you know, I'm not trying to undermine the validity of the insights. I'm just saying we're not really learning anything by doing this additional scenario making and modeling. But I think we could learn a lot more than we are, because I think we're currently trapped, if you like, with some limitations or some critiques of the way scenarios and models are currently done. And I'm going to just outline 3, I think, critiques, and this is where my props come into action. So the first one is that the modeling tools that we use, while there's quite a lot of them, if you remember back to my word search puzzle, they all share certain really important structural elements which constrain the scope of insights which we can learn from them. The second critique is that there are many, many really important things which we know about how the real world works, which are not included within the kind of analysis that we're doing. And then the third critique is that there's a sort of systematic skew in the kinds of scenarios that we're using to explore 1.5 degrees. So let me explain what I mean by each of these. So the first one is using my onion prop. Sorry, this is not a whole onion. This is actually a chopped up onion from the lunch, the cafe where we had lunch. But if you imagine a model as like an onion with a series of layers, if you look from the outside, the outer layers of different models or different onions will all look quite different. They'll all have different characteristics, different flavors, different emphases, and so on. But if you kind of cut down to the core, the sort of inner layers of these models, these onions, then they have certain features which are all shared. Now just remember that the way these models are used is these stories about the future are interpreted by the model through a combination of kind of basic assumptions the model makes about how the world works and the sort of inputs and constraints which you provide to the model. The model then generates its output and gives us these insights about mitigating climate change or reducing emissions. So even though many, many different models are used in this process of looking at 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C, this wide variety of models are to some extent kind of monocultural in their basic understanding about how the world works. And remember, a model is, at its heart, a very simplified representation of how the world works. So, as some examples, the models generally assume that the economy is in equilibrium, either full or partial equilibrium. And what that implies is that if you try and perturb or disturb that equilibrium by introducing climate policy, you will impose a cost on that system. So climate policy will always be costly. A second thing the models generally assume, or at their sort of structural heart, is that they optimize over cost, so they find these least cost pathways. Now, if you think about us as human society, and certainly politicians as decision makers, cost is undoubtedly important, but there are many, many other criteria which we might be trying to optimize. Anything from equity and distributional fairness to health outcomes and so on and so on. And these generally aren't, these aren't kind of integral to the way the models work. A very well-known critique of the models is that they tend to have this very, very detailed representation of the energy supply, but a very, very aggregated representation of energy demand. And this is an asymmetry which affects their results. And then relating to that is that they tend to assume that if you've got technology A and technology B, technology A will be preferred if it's least cost. But we know certainly as consumers, for consumer goods and services, we're interested in all sorts of other things which aren't costs. And in fact, any of you walking around with an iPhone in your pocket is clearly a kind of a good indication of how we're not simply price-sensitive consumers. So I could kind of go on, but the point is not really to list all lots of different things about the models. The point is to say that certain models share a basic understanding about the world, and this limits then the kinds of insights which we can learn about how to affect change in the real world. And so this then relates to my second point, and this is where I used my little lovely cuddly elephant as a prop to explain this. In relation to the kind of old parable of the blind men all feeling different parts of an elephant and reaching a very different kind of conclusion about what sort of beast it is that they're actually trying to understand. So if you think again about the way models are used to understand kind of 1.5 degrees C future, The reason that this blind man and the elephant parable is relevant is because there are many, many things which the models are sort of trying to feel and understand about reality and how systems change. And then there are many, many things, like the elephant's tail or the elephant's tusks, that they're not really able to examine. And again, this is a very well understood kind of critique that the models as a whole aren't very good at thinking about kind of politics and power. They're not very good at thinking about social legitimacy. They're not very good at thinking about how kind of markets and business models may lead to a whole range of novel goods and services that we as consumers may enjoy, and so on and so on. And so these processes, which we know are important about how systems change, are generally kind of external to the analysis that goes on trying to understand 1.5 degrees C. At best, these are used as a kind of lens through which to interpret the kinds of insights which we're gaining from the modelling. So this kind of blind man and the elephant parable then is again about how we're limited in our ability to understand the beast that we're trying to examine. And then the third critique is, and this is kind of the most technical part of the talk for those of you who are kind of thinking, who are worried. But the third critique is, I used the example of a map, in that, and mitigation scenarios, these scenarios to try and understand the challenge of 1.5 degrees, tend to have a systematic tendency towards some parts of this map, but not others. Now, the reason I use this map metaphor is that it's used a lot by the modelers themselves. So this is a quote from Ottmar Edenhofer, who was the senior scientist who convened all of the IPCC's work reviewing 2 degrees C scenarios. And he describes the role of scientists and researchers as that of map makers. They're charting out the terrain over which policymakers then have to make decisions about where to go. But the map I'm showing you is not a contemporary map, it's the Mercator map from the 16th century. And as you can see, even if you can't see the detail, you can hopefully see that, for example, Europe and North Africa and the Middle East are mapped out with great clarity. Whereas if you look at, for example, North America and South America, there's an awful lot of uncharted territory. And I think this is a good analogy for where we are with 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. Because what the scenarios do is that they tend to explore possible futures. They tend to chart terrain characterized by certain things. So generally, they all describe a world in which economies continue to grow, in which transitions are relatively smooth, in which there's a real emphasis on efficiency, so doing more with less. They tend to rely on the sort of portfolios of resources and technologies which we have available today. So they're very anchored in the present tense, if you like. And they tend to look at fairly kind of big scale, centralized systems. What they don't chart so well, so if you like, this is more the kind of the Americas in this Mercator map. The territory that they don't chart so well are futures in which there's an emphasis on qualitative progress rather than quantitative growth. Futures in which change is disruptive and sudden. Futures in which there's an emphasis on sufficiency, so enough, rather than always trying to do more with less. Futures in which there are technologies currently at the very fringes of our vision which play a major role, and futures in which there's a much greater emphasis on kind of decentralization and modularity. So these kinds of futures are really not being characterized in any depth by the current crop of scenarios and models that we have. So this is these three kind of fairly simple critiques of the work that goes on in the moment. And we've developed sort of responses to this, and our own work with colleagues is being shaped by this. And in a way, all of the responses to these three critiques are all about kind of diversifying and opening up analysis of these very, very ambitious climate change mitigation futures, opening them up to a much wider range of analytical tools, opening them up to a much wider range of insight from across the social sciences, and opening them up to a wider range of kind of storylines about what the future may look like, which can help us understand this challenge for 1.5 degrees. So in the next two parts of the talk, I want to give you some examples from my own research of how we hope we're starting to do some of these things. Okay, so yes, that was part one over. Is there any totally perplexed people who want me to explain anything, or shall I crack on? I'll interpret. Oh, yes, sorry.
Most of us are ready to retire after seeing that.
Great.
Perplexed, just curious, how much is already baked in as the product?
Baked into what?
How much is temperature rise from what we've already used?
Oh, varies 1.2 degrees C, about that. Yeah. Look, I mean, some uncertainty, definitely more than 1, probably less than 1.3. Yeah. Great, okay, so these next two bits then are about kind of empirical research that I've been doing, I'm currently working on with a variety of colleagues. And the first one is about granularity. And this is where, again, you have to use your imagination and pretend that this is a sugar lump. And I'm now going to, I was going to try and squash the sugar lump, but I'm just going to open this packet and drizzle lots of grains of sugar onto the counter. I will not, I'll cleaning up later, of course. So why am I talking about sugar lumps? Well, because there's a fundamental difference between a lump of sugar. Actually, I realise that there's also not a great metaphor, in that this is a lump, and this is a whole bunch of grains. So we're obviously not thinking about sugar for 1.5 degrees C. We're thinking about ways of supplying energy and also ways of using energy. But you can see from these examples that on both the supply and the use of energy, you can have very granular technologies which are small in unit size, relatively low in unit cost. They generally are modular and divisible, versus these very lumpy technologies like nuclear power plants or large jet aircraft, which are very large unit sizes, very high unit costs, and this is where my sugar lump analogy breaks down. They're indivisible. You can't have a bit of a nuclear power plant, but we obviously can have a bit of a sugar lump. But anyway, if you just go with me on this one. So granularity. So what we've been looking at is whether a kind of proliferation of these granular technologies can help accelerate change towards these very ambitious 1.5 and 2 degrees C targets. Now this kind of argument about granularity has a long tradition. This is a book published in the early 2000s by Amory Lovins, who's been, I think, probably the world's biggest guru, if you like, for the last 40 odd years, emphasizing the potential of an energy efficient and distributed future. And he still beats this drum with incredible kind of persuasive ability and intellectual rigor. And so we're kind of building very much on this sort of tradition. And what we've been doing is looking across very, very different kinds of technologies and trying to see if there are systematic benefits of granularity. And we've identified 10, and I'm going to give you 3 examples now. One is that they have lower adoption efforts, which results in faster diffusion. 2 is that they have shorter lifetimes, which lowers the risk of lock-in. And 3 is that they have lower barriers to adoption, and so they're more equitably distributed. And those of you who are thinking, oh, he's gone totally enumerate, he can't count, this is because this is 3 selected out of a portfolio of 10, and you'll see why they have these numbers a bit later on. So let me explain and give you quick bits of evidence for each of these 3 examples of the benefits of granularity. So the first one is that granular technologies, by definition, have lower unit costs. So they cost less per unit of investment. And if you plot, so this plot is showing this investment size on the x-axis. On the left, you have the very small investment sizes, and on the right, very large investment sizes. So it runs from granular to lumpy. And if you plot the time taken for these different technologies to diffuse into the market, and I'm using a metric here called the delta T, and the delta T describes the time from a 1% to a 50% market share, then you can see that there is a relationship. There's a lot of scatter, but there's a relationship between small unit sizes and small delta T's, which represents fast diffusion. So a fewer number of years taken to diffuse into the mass market. So what we did to do this is we looked at about 35 different energy and industrial product and processes and analysed this relationship between investment size and delta T. And we found that so investment size explains about 1/3 of the variation in diffusion speeds or diffusion times. Now you may kind of think, God, there's an awful lot of scatter on that plot. It's not a very good relationship. But if you think about the many things which are going to be explaining why technologies diffuse fast or slow, we thought we were actually staggered that we could explain as much as we could just with this one variable, how large the investment was per unit. So lower adoption effort results in faster diffusion. That's benefit number 1 for granular technologies. Benefit number two is that granular technologies tend to have shorter lifetimes. So you see here again on the x-axis we've got a scale that runs from granular to lumpy, very technical terms these, and you'll see on the y-axis this is now the lifetime of the technology, so the number of years in which it's designed to operate. And again you can see this is a much clearer relationship. More lumpy technologies tend to have much longer lifetimes. Now, why is this important? Well, there's a phenomenon or a characteristic of systems like the energy system is that they tend to be very resistant to change. And there's all sorts of reasons why. There are technological reasons, there are kind of institutional reasons about how markets and policy and so forth works, and there are also behavioral reasons that we're quite resistant to change as final consumers. But probably the dominant one that's examined in our work is the technological one. And one of the reasons that lock-in occurs because of technologies is that once you've built a technology with a very, very long lifetime, think about urban infrastructure or large power plants, then they tend to stay in place and are used until the end of their lifetime, unless you want to prematurely depreciate them as assets. So in other words, there's a very simple link from innovations which have shorter lifetimes, more granular innovations with shorter lifetimes, and the potential to avoid this inertia. And bear in mind that for 1.5 and 2 degrees C, we're talking about rapid change in systems. So we don't want our systems to be locked in. So this is the second possible benefit of granularity. And then the third one is that these granular technologies, small unit costs, small unit sizes, are much, if you like, easier and accessible for us as end users to adopt. And this results, interestingly, in a much more equitable distribution. So this is over the global population. This is showing something called a Gini coefficient. So Gini coefficients are a kind of widely used measure of how equal or unequal the access to a technology is, or the access to income is as well. And these are calculated from something called Lorenz curves, which basically plot the cumulative number of people on the planet versus the cumulative numbers of people with access to a particular technology, or as they were originally formulated, with certain levels of income. And essentially they're ways of estimating how equitably technologies are distributed. Now, what this plot shows is Gini coefficients on a scale of 0 to 1, and essentially a Gini coefficient of 0 means that a technology is totally equitably distributed, so it might mean that every one of you in this room has access to one of these technologies, and a Gini coefficient of 1 means that this technology is completely unequally distributed, so maybe every single one of these technologies is owned by Brian, who is very lucky and sits with all these technologies, and you lot have absolutely nothing. So this is what this scale is showing, and here we're plotting the Gini coefficients for the global distribution of certain energy-using technologies, from cars to computers to TVs, bicycles, and mobile phones, possibly the most evenly distributed technology, energy-using technology in the world. And you can see, again, this general pattern that as you get more granular, you have more equal access or more equal ownership. And the same applies not for end-use technologies, but also access to infrastructures. So if you go from broadband internet to electricity systems to improved sanitation and clean water, again, the sort of, if you think about the granularity as meaning, well, what extra bit of system do you have to build in order for people to have access to that? In the case of clean water, you can have a well in a village, but in the case of broadband internet, you need not just electricity systems, you also need 3G or mobile data communication systems and so forth. So again, in both these cases, the more granular the technology or the infrastructure, the more evenly it's distributed amongst the global population. So I'll give you 3 examples, and here's why they were numbered 1, 7, and 8. But we came up with 3 examples, I've shown you 3 examples from a cast of 10. So I've shown you that granular technologies can diffuse more quickly, I've shown you that they have lower risk of lock-in, and I've shown you that they can be more equitably distributed. And we also have evidence across a whole range of other benefits relating to innovation, relating to diffusion, so how these innovations get into the market, and then relating to the kind of outcomes of that diffusion, so how does it benefit people. And we've shown that granularity, granular technologies can diffuse faster, they're lower risk for the people adopting them, We can learn more quickly, so they can improve in performance and cost more rapidly. And they have shorter formative phases, by which I mean the time taken for them to get from, if you like, the labs, the R&D labs, where the technologies are being developed, into the marketplace, so they can get into the market quicker. So these are all benefits of granularity relating to innovation. In relation to diffusion, I've talked about lower risk of lock-in. We also find that they diffuse spatially more rapidly, by which I mean that if you imagine there's a given market which pioneers the development of a technology, so think about Finland and Sweden with mobile phones, for example, in the 70s and 80s, that these technologies, granular technologies, can then spread out of those initial markets more rapidly. And they also have much larger market sizes, so their transformative potential is larger. And these then give rise to this set of system outcomes. So not only that they are more equitably distributed, they have much greater potential to improve the efficiency of the overall energy system, and we've got evidence as well that they enjoy greater legitimacy. So a very wide and diverse set of benefits to these granular technologies. Again, remember my little kind of grains of sugar here on the front. And so this, we think, is sort of one really interesting angle or one interesting lens through which to look at this challenge of 1.5 degrees. Great. So that's the second bit of what I wanted to say over. Again, any questions? Yes?
Legitimacy, what's meant by legitimacy in that context?
We looked at lots of different measures of essentially social acceptance and also social resistance and opposition. And we found, for example, that there's an overall tendency for there to be less social resistance or more social support for the more granular technologies. Yeah.
Can you say something about buses versus cars? A bus is a less granular form of transport than a car.
Yes.
That would be more efficient, for example.
So you've identified the flaw. So what a lot of the research that I do is what I think of as kind of meta-analyses, where you look at very diverse ranges of technologies and innovations or whatever it is you're looking at, and you try and identify if there are kind of general rules across them. But the weakness, which I think is very powerful when you're trying to look at a big sort of global systems challenge like 1.5 degrees, in so doing, you lose an awful lot of contextual detail, like the fact that cars are generally private modes of transport and buses are generally public modes of transport and have higher load factors and so on and so on. So these kind of meta-analyses, you can always, if you like, find fault with them or see contradictions in them by picking particular technologies. So that is a terrible answer to your question in the sense that I'm saying, yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, there are many merits of buses over cars, which wouldn't be consistent with our granularity argument. But we're arguing, if you like, at a very generalized level. Yeah.
Oh, wait, just to pick that up, wouldn't you consider buses also to be a fairly granular technology? Because you're talking about having many buses working over a large area. You're not talking about having one sort of centralized thing working just in a small area.
Yes, true. And actually, and also you can have sort of, there's a kind of resurgent interest in the small kind of mini buses, like kind of beetling around, which can have variable routes rather than have fixed bus routes and so on. So even within that class of public transportation, there is from very granular to very lumpy. I guess a very lumpy example would be something like a new high-speed rail network, which again tends to be built in kind of one big go at enormous sort of costs.
And very limited coverage.
Yes, yeah. I'll come back to this a little bit later on. Okay, all good. So, so on to the final and third part on what disruptive low-carbon innovations and how relevant these might be to 1.5 degrees. And this is where I'm going to use my remaining props, but I'll explain these in a moment. So this work is born of the very basic insights that if you look historically at how energy systems have changed, it's been very strongly driven by improvements in the kinds of energy services that we as final users consume. So I've just shown you, if you like, a very, very potted history of changes in lighting and the incredible kind of improvement and qualitative change in that energy service. Here's a potted history of the change in mobility or how we get around and the kind of various innovations which have led to this explosion in the amount of mobility that we as final users consume. So these historical energy transitions, there's wonderful work on this by a colleague at LSE, London School of Economics in the UK, called Roger Fouquet, who looks at these very long historical periods from pre-industrial revolution to the present, and looks at the kinds of innovations and changes that are characterized those historical changes. And the role of the services that we as end users consume, and the demand that we have for novel, better performing, higher quality services is very, very, very clear in the historical record. We have demanded and enjoyed services with ever greater functionality, convenience, cleanliness at the point of use, and so on, as is hopefully exemplified by this kind of technological change story that I've shown you. But when you look at the kinds of innovations which are being analysed in these scenarios and models, they generally are ones which would be termed sustaining innovations. So they don't offer us anything particularly new. They just do a slightly better job at what we already value in the mass market. So think about whether it's solar panels on your roofs, whether it's large grid-scale battery storage allowing intermittent wind and solar onto the grid, whether it's things like insulating in home and any new efficient lighting, or whether it's things like hybrid electric vehicles or very, very fuel-efficient vehicles. While, just to be very, very clear, while I'm absolutely in no way saying that these aren't super important for mitigating climate change, they are. It's difficult to get really kind of excited about these as consumers of energy services. They don't offer us anything particularly new and different. They just do a bit better. They're a bit more efficient or a bit cheaper or a bit cleaner than what we already consume. So there's a guy called Clayton Christensen who wrote in the early 2000s a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, and this is kind of regularly in the top 10 most influential business books ever published, in which he made this distinction between these sustaining innovations, which essentially improve on what's currently valued in the market, and what he called disruptive innovations. And disruptive innovations have many different characteristics, but the one that I want to focus on is that they have this characteristic of offering us something new. They offer novel attributes. And the exemplar that Christensen uses in his work was, if you go back to the late 1970s and think about what computing was in the late 1970s, it was a market dominated by mainframe computers, which were getting ever more powerful, ever faster, with ever larger storage capacity. Like, this was the basis on which computing industry competed, and this led to people like Ken Olsen, who is the director of one of the large equipment manufacturers, in 1977 saying there is no need for anyone to have a computer in their home. And this is a guy who, I think 5 years later, was voted sort of top entrepreneur in the US, like clearly knew his stuff. But people didn't see what obviously we all know what happened. Along comes the microcomputer, and the microcomputer says, we're absolutely rubbish at competing on what the market seems to value, but we can offer something completely different. And so people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates in their garages, and a bit later on, people like me in my little cubbyhole of a bedroom who would sit coding my ZX Spectrum could have access to computing for the first time. So they offered these very novel attributes, and we all know what happens. Or what happened as a result. These disruptive innovations, if they catch hold, can change the nature of markets and can change the services which we enjoy as final users very, very rapidly. And so it's this characteristic of rapid change that we're interested in terms of 1.5 and 2 degrees C. So I said earlier that things like energy efficient vehicles would be classic sustaining innovations. They really just improve on what we already value. And the kind of attributes which we value in them are, we own vehicles to use, we're sensitive to upfront cost, we like the independence that these vehicles provide us with, and so forth. So what might be disruptive alternatives to this as the dominant mode of personal mobility, the dominant mode by which we get around? Well, there are many examples, but 2 of them are car sharing or car clubs, and obviously the sort of proliferation of kind of ride sharing, taxi hailing, really what's moving towards what's called mobility as a service. So rather than kind of owning and using your own vehicle, you treat mobility as a service which you consume as and when you need to use it, and you pay per use rather than pay to own. And the sort of attributes that these innovations have, they tend to be usage-based. Well, they are usage-based rather than ownership-based. They're carefree, so you're no longer responsible for kind of looking after, maintaining and caring for your assets. They often have a relational aspect, so often you're going from a kind of an autonomous, I own and use my car, to a system in which you have this implicit or explicit relationships with others using the same service. And another attribute they offer is variety of choice. So car sharing networks quite often have many different kinds of vehicles that you can then suit a vehicle to use for a particular purpose. Whereas obviously when you own your own car, that's the option that you always have to use. So these are just two examples relating to mobility. And in a project that I'm working on, we looked at 10 examples relating to mobility, 10 examples relating to energy, 10 relating to food, and 10 relating to cities and housing. And we had a couple of workshops about a month ago in which we had one workshop with a whole bunch of people working on innovation and another workshop with people working on research and things like 1.5 degrees. And one of the things we did in the workshops, we asked them to rank all of these potentially disruptive innovations which we identified from the literature. And here's just one example of this ranking exercise. So very, very simply, from bottom up to top, these technologies are ranked as being potentially more disruptive. So if you like, potentially more novelty in the attributes and the service that they're offering. And this x-axis is to larger potential reduction on emissions. So essentially, according to the experts we had in our workshops, it's these ones up in the top right that we're interested in as being potentially very disruptive. So they have this characteristic of being able to change systems very quickly and with a potentially large impact on emissions. And these two in the very top right are electric vehicles and mobility as a service. So again, this mobility as a service idea is about not owning kind of an asset like a car that you use to get around, but just using whatever form of mobility may be most appropriate for whatever journey you need to make, being able to access it all through a single gateway, like an app on your phone, and paying per use rather than paying per ownership. And this mobility as a service idea, as well as the role of electric vehicles as part of a wider electricity system, is really being opened up by the convergence between the digital worlds and the energy worlds. So if you think about in domestic systems, for example, the difference between having a PV system on your roof, where you're just generating electricity for your own consumption or to export, and then you're moving towards a world in which you have a PV system on your roof with battery storage in your home, and that battery storage can be in the form of the engine that powers your car or the battery that drives your electric vehicle, and you have some clever algorithms and IT systems which allow you to store excess solar production in your vehicle and then actually trade any surplus that you may have with your neighbors, for example, or members of your community through a kind of peer-to-peer electricity trading system. So this is this kind of idea of how there might be, in this case, a convergence between the transport system and the electricity system, as well as opening up a whole range of different peer-to-peer kind of services that we may consume. And this is where I've got these 4 bits of my 4 final props: the solar panel, the battery, the car, and the mobile phone. So each of these innovations with their own kind of technological journeys, but what this represents is essentially a convergence between all of them. I bought some masking tape and I was going to try strapping them all together, but I think that'll probably end in disaster, so I'll just leave the masking tape there and let you imagine that. So again, this kind of idea has many people kind of excited and working on it. So there's a guy called Tony Sieber, who's a Stanford economist in Silicon Valley, who writes in very sort of hyperbolic terms about this. And he's just produced a report called Rethinking Transportation. And I discovered this, coincidentally, on the train coming over yesterday, because it was front page news in the Daily Telegraph. I'm not an actual Daily Telegraph reader, but it was sitting on the seat. It was sitting on the seat next to me, and this was front page of the Daily Telegraph. All vehicles will be electric by 2025. And I've got the article here if anyone wants to read it, but it was basically a digest of this new report that Sieber and colleagues have written. So here's a quote from this report. Mobility as a service will reduce energy demand by 80% and emissions by over 90%. And if you're thinking, well, over what time frame? by 2030, so within 15 years. Because he makes the argument that essentially the drivers of change, so excuse it's amazing how many metaphors are related to driving, but the drivers of change in this transportation system are so strong in terms of the declining costs of batteries, the improving performance characteristics of electric vehicle, and all sorts of other potential consumer benefits, that there'll be this switch over by 2025. And if solar and wind essentially penetrate the electricity system over a similar time frame, you could have almost zero carbon road transport by 2030. So, staggering claims. And you may think these are completely out to lunch or not. The reason that I say this is because at least this is worthy of study when it comes to thinking about 1.5 degrees and scenarios. But this kind of future is not really imagined to date in the literature that we see, in the studies that we see around 1.5 degrees. So then, to wrap up, I put these and potential contributions to 1.5 degrees C in red, because you may be thinking, well, he hasn't said anything about those at all. Like, how big are the emission reductions? Can we rely on them on our scenarios?
Can I just make a comment
Yeah.
about the last thing you said about the 2030 business?
Yeah.
There are some interesting social things that may come into this, because if people become convinced that, we're consumers, if consumers become convinced that the thing to have is an electric car rather than a petrol car, I think we'd be amazed at how quickly the petrol cars would vanish and electric cars would start appearing, because they would become a status symbol.
Yes, they become a status symbol, as well as many other things besides. He actually, the vision that he characterizes is actually not just a switch from petrol to electric, but also a switch from self-driving to autonomous vehicles, which then suddenly, very dramatically changes the nature of what getting around is all about, because you'll essentially free up your time. All the things that you would currently do while staring at the road are opened up. And also you have, his sort of vision is fleets of autonomous vehicles, which you just call up on demand. So again, you don't have to own one. He's talking about vehicle ownership dropping by about 75%, because you have access through an app on your phone to an autonomous vehicle for any journey when you need to make it. So this is this sort of vision. But I think the reason, part of the reason I put up this 2030 thing is to say that, at least in some people's view, this is not a kind of future, a science fiction future. This is very, very much happening and observable in some parts of the world today. I should emphasize this is focused on the US, and also, he's based in Silicon Valley, where arguably these trends are sharper than anywhere else.
And is it also in urban areas, with dense population? I mean, obviously, back in Australia, I can't see how, Uber is going to be, there when you need it.
Yes, yeah. So this was in the US, and he specifically argues this will happen first in cities, and then out into suburbs, and then out into rural areas. But the world is rapidly urbanizing. More than half the world's population, I think in 2008, has been living in cities. I think it's forecast to be 70% by mid-century. So we are in a very urban world where the mass of transport is consumed. So let me just quickly finish and then see what time we got left for questions. So so I haven't sort of sat and crunched the numbers about what of that emissions budget left for 1.5 degrees C. These kinds of ideas around granularity and around disruptive low carbon innovations can contribute. That's actually my work for the summer. But I kind of use these as examples of things which really are not part of current thinking around 1.5 degrees, but certainly should be. And there are many, many other kind of examples as well. So in some sense, just to sort of wrap up where I began with these kind of critiques of scenarios and modeling, and with the responses in terms of needing to open up, to diversify, to create more kind of plural and wider analytical approaches to this amazing challenge of 1.5 degrees. I see this as really not so much a critique, but as this kind of amazing opportunity that we have as a science and research community to respond to this big global challenge, and to respond with the maximum amount of kind of imagination and creativity that we can. And so that's the sort of basic argument that I wanted to make. So thank you very much for listening.